Hello, hi Xavier. Nice to have you. All right, we are covering today a couple big ones. All right, and that is the imperialist American movement overseas. Yeah, thank you, Xavier. Thank you for asking that. I appreciate that. Yeah, I got antibiotics, etc., and they've relatively done their job. They always make me better, if not completely better. Um, but how are you doing, Xavier? You doing okay? All right. Well, I received a chat from you, so I'm assuming you're doing okay. I'm hoping so. I'm glad to have you. With number one, okay, what I do is I take the court history route. Remember, with court history, you can't deny facts, right? We are going to take over the Philippines until the end of World War II. We're going to take Guam, turn it into a military base. We're going to take Puerto Rico and turn it into an odd type of territory to this day. Um, we are going to take what else am I missing? The Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico. We're going to take Cuba for 4 years before we leave, and supposedly clean it up. Um, and the list goes on. And so you can't deny that, right? And in academia, being called an imperialist is basically being called a bully, right? Imposing your will upon the sovereignty or independence and the resources of another sovereign people. So the next best thing we could do, right, is contend that we felt compelled. We felt compelled to act accordingly, right, aggressively. So then number one is the role of dangerous ideas, right? When I say dangerous, I don't mean to use hyperbole, right, like exaggerated or strategic exaggeration to make my point, but I kind of am going to. Um, Friedrich Nietzsche, whether he meant to or not, whether it was accurate or not, the inferences from his works, he was credited by Adolf Hitler and the German National Socialists for inspiring them in many of his thoughts. Okay. And so what I'm saying is you could go a dangerous route in your behavior if you carry some of these beliefs out to their logical end. Okay. So firstly, right, I think it all starts with social Darwinism. It was the idea, right? Because exospecies evolution is a theory to this day. I'm sorry, that's subjective of me. Well, I don't think it's a subjective fact, but it's subjective of me to harp on it. But evolution from one species to another, the fossil record has yet to show that. But there was great belief in it at this time, and so with that came social Darwinism. There was a guy named Huxley. He was known as Darwin's bulldog. There was a guy named Spencer, and they became very popular with their beliefs that, like in the world of living beings, that societies live in a hostile environment that wants to take them out, and that they must adapt. They must adapt consistently to survive and thrive, because it's a dog eat dog world out there. And so this was completely by choice, right? By volition, um, although not completely, because they believed that different races of people, as they use that term still, had perhaps evolved from different ancestors. And so, like, there might literally be different species amongst humanity, which, of course, we don't believe today. Um, so, to some extent, they thought perhaps some people just weren't capable of making these decisions and doing it well and wisely. But it also ultimately became a choice, right? So you choose to embrace military technology. You choose to embrace political modernization. All right. Those were kind of the two main examples. Uh, and you stay up with the times or you don't. And you must if your society wants to survive and thrive. All right. With social Darwinism. And so it didn't get into mutations that people are born with that are favorable or anything like that. But the general theme of Darwinism, they kept. and put it to a societal level. So at any rate, you have that. Then you had the kind of dystopians, right? You had Malthus. Malthus was the Mad Max guy, right? As I call him. He was the guy that believed that society was increasing exponentially, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, instead of 2, 4, 6, 8, and that they were going to outstrip the amount of the availability of resources that the world has to offer, that the planet has to offer, and so that there would be a mad dash to fight over those scarce resources sometime, and perhaps sometime soon. Then you had Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and they made it out to be a race and national fight. That different races are going to fight it out for scarce resources, who knows how soon, and they better be prepared to do such. All right. And then you had the people that had a much more benign look at this, and they tried to turn good into it, and they called it the white man's burden. And they assumed that the Western civilizations of Western Europe and the United States, particularly, with their Anglo-Saxon blood, for them that it was natural to constantly evolve and be at the forefront of progressive things, right? Things ahead of your time. And so therefore they didn't have as much to worry about as some of these backward societies, right? And so therefore it would actually be a good thing if they took over some small island people, etc., and caught them up to speed. That it'd be their job to teach them Christianity, to teach them a modern capitalist economy, to teach them Republican representative government, and modern military, etc. Okay, that they'll be better off for it because they won't become extinct, as will inevitably happen, supposedly, if they don't get help. And then you had people that had a much more American-centered solution to these problems that they were perceiving at this time, at the fin de siècle, at the end of the 1800s. Okay, and that is that they contended that you got to put America first, right? And so their answer for that was geopolitics. And geopolitics, the father of that, as far as intellectually known, was Mahan, Mahan. And Mahan contended that you look at the map as like a soon-to-be war zone. You look at your most prospective threats. And of course, at this time, we thought they were namely Germany and England, perhaps in that order. So we said, where on the map would be absolutely vital for us to have resources, for us to keep our Navy, for us to have access to coal, to use the steam power for the ships of the Navy, etc. Right? And the idea is you take over those lands. You start off with a quid pro quo, right? You scratch my back, I scratch yours, and you contend, hey, why don't you allow us to keep our Navy here, at this city here in Haiti, and we will in return offer you certain economic benefits. But the problem is with geopolitics is you don't take no for an answer. So if their answer is no, then you begin threatening, okay? And you do what you have to put your resources on that supposedly geopolitically strategic area that you think could and will be of great importance to you when you are eventually attacked by that threat. All right. So now it leaves room for being very arrogant and ethnocentric with people in weaker, militarily weaker civilizations that are in vital spots on your map. All right. So we considered like the Caribbean like our front porch. We considered the Pacific our backyard, and you have to keep those areas safe. So it was no coincidence that we threw our weight around in Haiti, in the Caribbean, And we threw our weight around with Samoa and the Hawaiian or Sandwich Islands in the Pacific, as well as Midway, etc. So at any rate, with number one, it's saying that we believed that we had to get aggressive, okay, that we had to get aggressive in this dangerous world, okay? And that's kind of trying to justify what we are going to do. So you see here, right, in very paternalistic fashion, Uncle Sam is trying to catch these backward people up to speed. The Puerto Ricans, the Cubans. Boy, my eyesight is leaving me. I think that's Hawaii and the Philippines. All right, in this picture, you see the Native American in the corner with his book. Okay, and then a new person of color coming in to join the school. And then you have these well-meaning progressive women and men who are going to teach them and catch them up to speed. And we'll get into the progressive movement soon, but this is the beginning of the progressive era, the 1890s. And there was a lot of paternalism that was involved in that. Educated, old middle-class people trying to catch immigrants up to speed back in the States, and poverty-stricken people, etc. Number two, right? It gets right into how we were, how supposedly our two consecutive presidents were very hesitant to get involved in the Spanish-American War. In the spring and summer of 1898, we were going to fight Spain in Cuba, in the Philippines, and a little bit in Puerto Rico. Yeah, and it's going to be called a splendid little war because of, on account of the light casualties, the quickness with which the war was won, and the territories which we gained from it. All right. And so with Spain, right, the idea is, first of all, they have to become the bad guy. They have to become a threat. Well, they'd already done so on a couple occasions. The Cubans had tried to rise in rebellion to their Spanish overlords, their colonizers, in the 1870s, because they were known as the Ever Faithful Isle, right? From 1810 to the 1820s, almost all of Latin America became independent from Spain, but not Cuba. So they tried in the 1870s, and we had a group of primarily, supposedly, Cuban and American dual nationals who felt a love for their home country, and they were smuggling in arms to the rebels, the Cuban rebels. And they were caught on a particular ship, and they were fired upon and killed instead of merely being arrested, having their arms confiscated, etc. They were kind of summarily just put to death. And the Spanish were arrogant about it when we confronted them about that. We also have become insecure over the Venezuelan crisis. In Nicaragua, on the Mosquito Coast, and in Venezuela, the nearby English in Guyana were trying to take the Orinoco River because it had gold. Venezuela claimed it for themselves. And so they sold it to an American company, hoping the Americans could get involved and keep the British from bullying the Orinoco River from Venezuela. And when we had negotiations between our ambassadors and theirs, we cited the Monroe Doctrine, right? That Europe needs to stay out of the American hemisphere. And the British ambassadors basically laughed at that and said, let's see you enforce it. We don't recognize the Monroe Doctrine as international law, and we don't believe you have the muscle to back it up. So that was humbling as well. And then in Chile, we had an episode in which sailors went into a True Blue saloon, got drunk, had a melee, and a couple security guards stabbed a couple of them to death. And we demanded a formal apology and some type of recompense. And the Chilean leader refused to. His name was Balmaceda, and he was defiant toward the U.S. So we're already supposedly feeling insecure. And so what happens, right, is yellow journalism takes off. With yellow journalism, it is taking things out of context, being dramatic, sometimes exaggerating or even lying with your information. And you're deliberately trying to incite certain emotional responses from your readers. There was a famous anecdote, and we don't know if it's true or not, but whereby Hearst or Pulitzer supposedly boasted to one of his writers. He said, "You go to Cuba and furnish me the pictures, and I'll furnish you a war, right? That I'll get American public sentiment so whipped up against the Spanish that I'll start a war." And so with yellow journalism, it did bring up a lot of anti-Spanish sentiment within the population. Yes, they contend with this thesis that Americans and humans in general are rather credulous. They're quick to believe what they see and hear. And so you have there toward the middle Valeriano Weyler of the Spanish army, and he did a recontracion reconcentration program. The Cubans were fighting guerrilla warfare, right? Little warfare. And because they couldn't stand toe to toe with the Spanish army. And so in doing so, Weyler became convinced that he could not trust the Cuban peasants as a whole. So he began putting them in concentration camps. And in doing so, a lot of them died of disease, malnutrition. You see the picture of that boy there, just emaciated. And the public was angry about this. All right. And Spain was depicted as an old Don Quixote imperialist, right? Thinking that she still lived in the golden age of the 1500s, trying to take over American hemisphere countries and keep a hold of them, etc. So then, in addition to that, the Cuban immigrants themselves and the Cuban leaders themselves did things to try to provoke American help against the Spanish. Okay, so you have Antonio Maceo, who helped lead the rebellion there on the left. You had kind of their Thomas Jefferson and Jose Marti, their main writer, and he will go and try to fight and immediately get killed, unfortunately. But at any rate, they formed juntas, right? These committees, and they formed them up here in the U.S. And they tried to rally Latino Americans in particular to raise money to come volunteer as soldiers, mercenary fighters, and help the Free Cuba cause, the Cuba Libre cause. Okay, and they did it primarily in Florida, New York, California. All right. And in doing so, it had some success. Not to mention, at El Galeon, the leaders got together and decided that for those for the hacendado, the hacienda owners who were loyally siding with Spain. You can imagine why, right? They had everything to lose and nothing to gain from Cuban independence. They were living well under the Spanish. They contended that they would start burning their plantations. They were well aware in that meeting of the fact that some of these well-to-do Spanish Cubans, large landowners, were dual nationals, American nationals as well. And according to the 5th and 14th Amendment, Americans' life, liberty, and property is to be protected by the federal government. Well, does that mean overseas? Well, it's been up to the interpretation of each administration. So with Grover Cleveland, he said, "Nope, not going to work. You're not going to lull us into this. You're not going to pull us into this by putting to fire American citizens' property. That's simply arson, and I'm not playing that game." And then when McKinley came in, when he ran in 1896, of course, there was a lot of domestic issues, especially with the gold, the currency being put on the gold coin, which is a whole other topic. He ran on a foreign policy that was pro-business, but not fighting, not intervention. So when Cleveland comes in, he makes every type of indication that he is not for going to war with Spain either. just like his predecessor, Cleveland. So what happens, right, is you have a case in which the American Navy, uh, he feels compelled that, okay, I'm already coming across as a wimp, all right, because according to this very interesting book, um, you have the term zeitgeist of machismo, right? That because of the social Darwinism being so in vogue at this time, that the American and Western civilization culture was all about militarism, manliness, showing strength and courage, never backing down to your foes, etc. Because, by the way, right, with those dangerous ideas percolating, they believed that it was necessary to be like that. So, thinking ahead of time and running for re-election in 1900, McKinley knew that his popularity was waning on account of his anti-war sentiment. Okay. There was a De Lome letter, and it was from one Spanish diplomat to another. And it contended that they didn't think they needed to worry about President McKinley because he didn't seem to have much of a backbone. And the press got a hold of it by way of an Englishman, and they ran with it, calling our president a wimp. All right. So supposedly, he's feeling some pressure to kind of stand in the middle of the spectrum, right? Not being a war hawk, but not being a complete dove and wimp in the eyes of his population and his citizens, his constituents. So at any rate, there was a famous bullfighter, and he was due to have a famous bullfight. All right. And he came to Havana, and it drew an international crowd. Well, the Cubans, right, taking advantage of that, as you see, like the Tibetans did, like with the Olympics in China, they protested very vocally, very visibly at this bullfight. And supposedly a lot of dual nationals who were also American citizens were roughed up and unduly arrested, attacked, etc. So supposedly President McKinley was talked into showing a show of force, right? So we sent the USS Maine into Havana Harbor just as a message to the Spanish that we are watching what they're doing. And in particular, we're watching what they're doing to dual nationals who are American citizens, technically. All right. Well, it was there for about a month. It was awkward. They allowed Spaniards to come aboard and dined with them to try to show their peaceful intent. But despite that, it blows up, and it kills about 250 Americans. All right. And look what he says here. I do not propose to be swept off my feet. He says, I'm still not going to war, even though American soldiers have died on Cuban soil or on Cuban waters. And so at any rate, we had a scuba team determine that the source of the explosion was external. So it was likely a mine that was placed there. And of course, the Spanish team found evidence near the kitchen and the steam engine that it was an implosion, an accident, and no one had done so. So of course, right, we stuck with our interpretation in our press and everything with many of our government leaders. And then you have here, Senator Chandler said, we will declare war despite him. So you had your group of war hawks that were very loud in the Senate in particular. All right. Henry Cabot Lodge was kind of their unspoken leader. And so Don Cameron, Roger Mills, Robert Hitt. Okay. And so at any rate, yeah, they're going to make a lot of noise and put a lot of pressure on the president to do something. So at any rate, at this time, afterwards, the president says, I got to build up my empire. I got to build up the military just in case we go to war. All right. And then what actually causes the war is he is going to issue an ultimatum. He is going to give Spain so much time And I once knew that amount of time, and I don't. I apologize. But he's going to give Spain so much time to either squash the rebellion in Cuba or come to terms with which the Cuban rebels are willing to agree. And if they don't, in that amount of time, the Americans are going to militarily intervene. All right. And so the Spanish obviously don't meet that ultimatum, and he asked Congress to declare war against Spain. So according to court history, our president was the quiet guy at the bar who wanted no trouble, and he was pulled kicking and screaming into this conflict. Then I take a 180 and say, this guy was an enigma. He was a puzzle, this president of ours, right? He's going to be assassinated. He is going to, as he's laying and dying, he's going to forgive the Polish immigrant who killed him, shook his hand, and then shot him a few times in the side. He's going to worry about his poor wife who had issues. When people got nasty with him when he was a senator for quite some time before becoming president, he would never get in the mud with them. He was too classy for that. All right. And after all this time, he's been showing nothing but hesitation to get involved in the war. But the ultimatum, right? He should have known that Spain could not meet that ultimatum. So therefore, right, he's issuing an ultimatum that he knows can't and won't be met. So is he secretly looking for an excuse to get involved in this war, but still look like a dove? Okay. The Spanish parliamentary elections, they made a switch from their conservatives to their liberals. And the liberals were for meeting the colonists, the Cuban colonists, halfway. So they issued them the autonomy decrees. And they're basically offering Cuba to be kind of like Canada under Great Britain, to have much internal and domestic autonomy, to do as they wish and elect their own leaders, but to have Spain run their foreign policy and their military. Of course, the Cuban rebels said they would accept nothing short of complete independence. So it didn't work. The Pope offered to intervene, and the president said, no, don't bother. All right. So again, is he trying his utmost to keep the peace? That's something of question. So then once we get involved in the war, due to the ultimatum not being met, he decides to invade Puerto Rico and the Philippines as well. And everything about our war declaration, about our yellow press, everything was always about Cuba. So why are we getting involved in these other areas as well? Well, he does have one thing on his side factually, is the brunt of the Spanish Navy was in the Philippines, was in Manila. And he said it was vital to defeat that contingent of their Navy in the Philippines. However, right, in the battle of Subic Bay, we only lost one man, and we quickly and easily took Manila. And they didn't want their beautiful buildings destroyed, etc., and they surrendered rather quickly and easily. But then he sends thousands of foot soldiers into the Philippines, into their various islands of their archipelago to fight. And people are questioning why, right? In Puerto Rico, their leaders had accepted the autonomy decrees offered by Projeda Sagasta of Spain. And so hence they were okay with Spain. So our guys were literally told, beware with the Puerto Ricans. They may put up arms against you, not wanting your help, because they had made an agreement with Spain that they were okay with, right? So that's odd. That's extremely odd, because we're coming under the guise of being the liberators of these people. So at any rate, we fight. And then there's this administration right here. Katipunan, I'm sure I'm butchering that. But this was kind of like the Sons of Liberty chapter of the Filipinos. Okay. And by this time, it was led by Emilio Aguinaldo. And they, from the very beginning, were reticent about accepting our help because what they're afraid of, right, is once we had helped them defeat Spain, that we would stay there and not leave as their new colonizer. Also, by the way, Jose Marti did a 180 himself. He initially was wanting American help, and then he traveled to New York, lived there for a while, and became disabused of that idea and did not trust America for the same reasons to come and help the Cubans. But we're coming whether they want them or not, whether they want us or not, right? And by the way, we did not militarily cooperate with Katapunan virtually at all. We did our own fighting. And then in Manila, when the keys to the city were handed over to us, we not only accepted those keys rather than allowing the native Filipino Katapunan leaders to accept such a reward and symbol, but we also did not even invite them to the ceremony. They did not even take part in the surrendering ceremony. So clearly we were planning on staying there and in the driver's seat. So then the Filipinos met at Malolos and they formed a constitution. And what do you know? That constitution was modeled primarily after the American Constitution. So it should have impressed us, but it did not. And William McKinley said, basically, don't be silly, Filipinos. You're not ready for a federal republic as we have, as a, quote, backward Filipino, Malaysian, and Hispanic people. E. Spencer Pratt and Commodore Dewey told Aguinaldo, assured him verbally that we would not stay. Okay. That we'd help them, we'd fix a few things for them, and then we'd leave. When asked to put it in writing, neither of them would. All right. So that's ominous for things to come. Then number 4, a U.S. Pursuing its own self-interest, particularly economic self-interest, even at other nations' expense. When you look at people like Charles Denby and other ambassadors that we sent to Asia and these other places, right? They threatened, they tried to bribe, they tried every manner of opening up Asian markets to American businessmen. Okay. In particular, as you might be familiar with, like with the Boxer Rebellion, is we and England and other Western Civ countries were bullying our way into Canton in China, in Southeast China. So we bullied our way into Canton. We bullied our way into the Unsan mines of Korea. We had already bullied our way into Japan back in 1854 when we forced them to open their doors to trade to us. All right, as far as East Asia. Then when the Boxer Rebellion happened against foreigners in China, we sent soldiers to squash it. So here we are, right? Fighting a rebellion in a separate sovereign country on the other side of the world. We tried to bully Haiti once again. We could not get concessions from Legitime. It's French. I have no idea. I apologize. So there was a guy named Hippolyte, and he raised a rebellion. We armed him, helped him, provided that he would give such concessions to us. And once he got in control, he double-crossed us, and he refused to. And we threatened to invade Haiti. And I can't remember if it was Germany or England stood by, and it could have been even France, as involved as France was in Haiti's economy and so forth. They threatened armed resistance against us in support of Haiti. So we were like the bad guy, the bully, and it did not look good. So, of course, we didn't do it. Then we had, right, these filibusters, these American pirates like William Walker, who went in and virtually took over Nicaragua with his own private army. This was happening throughout Latin America. All right. We also had got our foot involved in Panama very early with the railroads and other businesses that were going through the Isthmus of Panama, right? A narrow strip that connects two larger land bases as a way to go through the Americas instead of having to go all the way underneath Argentina and Peru in South America. So at any rate, we tried to use our businessmen as a step in to create a canal, right? So the Colombians were the ones who controlled present-day Panama, and they said no. And we'd already helped the Colombians in putting down a rebellion in Panama prior to this. So now we do a 180 because we're following self-interest and the Colombian leaders are not cooperating. And we helped arm and support a Panamanian war for independence. And then what makes it worse is when the army of Colombia came down to fight them. There was a Diamante, there was a area in which American companies were there. And we said, you can't come near these companies. These are American citizens. We're protecting their 5th and 14th right to their property and their lives. You can't fight in this area or near this railroad. And so we manipulatively tied the hands behind the Colombian army in being able to put it down. So the Panamanians prevail and they get their independence. And what do you know? Their first order of business is renting us a 10-mile swath of width across Panama to build a canal. We used private companies, big corporations. They were subsidized by the federal government, and we exploited a lot of Latin American laborers who died. For instance, one main cause was malaria, but at any rate, many of them died in accidents and other things as well. And so, yeah, we're just throwing our weight around. There was a guy named Samuel Zamuri, known as the Banana Man in Honduras, for the Banana Republic. And he threw his weight around as somewhat of a filibuster, an American capitalist, and had way too much sway in Honduras as well. Right? And the instances go on and on. Then what we sometimes did is we used the very gunboat diplomacy that the Europeans were guilty of. We would virtually force some of these new and weaker Latin American countries to take loans from our banks, from Americans, right? And then if and when they ever defaulted on those loans, our Navy would come in and they would take over their customs offices that took in the internal tariffs and other taxes in the port cities, and they would help themselves to the income that our banks were owed. All right. And in some extreme cases, Germany and France did the same, like with Haiti, is we even insisted on running their budget to ensure that that American bankers were paid back. All right. And that was known as gunboat diplomacy. Oh gosh, Otto von Bismarck, the counselor, the equivalent of a president. They called him something I can't recall, the premier or something. But at any rate, the chancellor of Germany, he did some lying, some manipulative things to get Schleswig and Holstein from Denmark, and to take Alsace and Lorraine from France, etc. And he called it realpolitik. He said, "I'm not going to apologize. This is real life politics. I'm looking out for my new country of Germany," because Germany didn't become a country uniting the 39 states until like 1870. He said, we're not going to apologize for realpolitik. So that's who I'm quoting here at the end. that this was old-fashioned realpolitik, geopolitics. We are looking out for ourselves, even at the expense of other countries. All right. Then, present censure of American imperialism in the Philippines ought to be mitigated by the presence of some good intentions. All right. So, for instance, right, you have those beliefs again. You have the idea of eugenics and phrenology as a so-called science, supposedly studying the skull of people of different races to see how far evolved they had become from their primate ancestors. We came to the conclusion that the Filipinos, as with other people, were other quote island people, were inferior biologically. All right. We sent a team of progressives under the USS Thomas ship, progressive professors and teachers, to establish a public school system in the Philippines and help them out in becoming more literate and educated. We also had a health and sanitation brigade in Cuba as well as in the Philippines, and we helped bring down the instances of deaths by disease quite greatly. We did to play devil's advocate. Also, with the type of government that we had, we tried to do a progressive evolution, right? So, for instance, they could elect their own alcalde, because remember, they had been under Spain since the 1500s, like 1519 or something like that, or 1530s. And so they had the Spanish old system of an alcalde mayor, like a mayor, cabildo, a city council, a governor, etc. So what we did is we allowed them to have their own city councils and their own mayors. And then at the regional level, instead of governor, we had a 3-person executive. There was 2 handpicked Americans and 1 chosen Filipino. Then in their legislature, we had 2 houses. And in the 2 houses, the lower house was popularly elected by the Filipinos. And of course, they elected fellow Filipinos. But then we had an upper branch that consisted of handpicked Americans. All right. And then we supposedly picked progressive people like the future President Howard Taft to control the judge system, to make sure that the judges were fair and not racist, and just carried out true justice in adjudicating disputes, etc. Right. But you see in the red here is we really believed, some of the people really believed that these were inferior people, that they were not accustomed to self-government under the Spanish, and that they were not biologically and culturally, nature and nurture, prepared for self-government. And that's why we were going to allow them to participate in government, but give ourselves ultimate kind of veto power, right? And also we had a hand-picked president governor over the entire archipelago, right? As the executive of this so-called republic that we established in the Philippines. So they were technically under tutelage, all right? Now, when you look at the amount of money, I wish I could have garnered some type of number, and I'm still aiming for that. But when you look at the amount of money that we invested in Cuba and in the Philippines, we spent a lot of tax money in quote improving their institutions, education, the medical field, particularly infrastructure with roads and railroads, etc., and so forth. All right. Not only that, is we're going to issue something very paternalistic over the Cubans that they're not going to like, and it's called the Platt Amendment, named after Oliver Platt, a congressman, Platt. And in the Platt Amendment, we reserved our right to intervene in Cuban affairs anytime in the future, in the name of stability and in the name of Americans' self-interest. Okay. And so they're going to have a rebellion. And it's going to be inspired by a guy named Evaristo Esteños. And he was a black Cuban. He was a member of the press. And he wrote ill of Estrada Palma, the president. And there is evidence that there were some irregularities in the election of Palma. But when Palma came in, he appeared to be quite corrupt, quite oppressive. Okay. He had Evaristo Esteños, this black journalist, he had him arrested for what he wrote. So much for anything that was, similar to a First Amendment right. And but he also, what he had on his side is he was somewhat an American corporation ally and selling large swaths of land to big coffee and sugar planter corporations. All right. And by the way, it's a very similar theme in the Hawaiian Islands. All right, with the Haole, with the white Americans. So at any rate, with Palma, he's going to have a rebellion on his hands. And a lot of them are going to say that Evaristo Esteños was like their source of inspiration, the guy that was arrested. And yes, a lot of the rebels happen to be black Cubans. So Teddy Roosevelt, right, on the negative side, intervenes and says Palma was elected. He remains the president. So of course, right, he backed the corrupt and oppressive American, arguably puppet Palma instead of the rebels. Okay. But what he did also do is when he found out about this rebellion, he threw a major fit in the White House. And he supposedly did not want to have to mess with this and have to bring soldiers down there. He knew he'd inevitably lose some soldiers, etc. Right? But he really did have like this paternalistic sense, like these backward Cubans. Why are they making me babysit them already under the Platt Amendment? We just established it, and I'm already having to enforce it. So you know what I mean? There was a genuine condescension by Americans, whereby they perhaps truly did believe they were superior to these people, and that yes, they were getting theirs, right, in the form of helping out corporations, being able to have a military presence there, etc. No doubt about that. But that went along with white man's burden, right? It's supposed to be a win-win situation. And they also believed, some of them, perhaps honestly, sincerely, that they were helping these backward people out. And somewhat, like in the case of the Palma, the rebellion against Palma, Estrada Palma, that they were babysitting these inferior people. I know that's very politically correct, and I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate here. All right. So we said the Filipinos are incapable of self-government, as incapable as children. So they needed a time of tutelage and protection. The Sherman Commission was a progressive commission that wanted to catch them up to speed with education, medical care, infrastructure, and military or economic development, etc. All right. We also worked with the small middle class of Filipino leaders, and some of them collaborated with us because in many cases, right, they actually they gained from this, right, as they had been privileged under Spain. Some of these educated Filipinos, they were now becoming, a bit better off than the masses by collaborating with the Americans. Now, did they know that the Spanish still did not treat them as true equals? These Filipino middle class people, absolutely. And did they know that it was the same under us? Absolutely. All right. They were never accepted as equals, no matter how educated they were, no matter how wealthy they became. There was a book written. It's translated in English as "Touch Me Not." It's quoting Jesus when he told Mary Magdalene not to touch him when he'd been resurrected. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman who wrote that. But at any rate, he was a well-to-do Filipino, very educated, and he wrote that, but he was complaining about the Spanish, despite his kind of privileged lifestyle. Okay, and I have his name in here somewhere. I apologize. Then in the insular cases, we made it clear that they were not to be treated as equals. In the insular cases, it said, basically, in a nutshell, the Constitution does not have to fully follow the American flag. So as the American flag expands and takes over these island people and these new nations, they are not guaranteed automatically all American citizenship rights, which is terrible, terrible. And they were known as the insular cases. All right. But we did allow a free press. We did allow a multi-party system in the Philippines, including some parties, one of which was pretty popular, that was very adamantly anti-American and wanted Philippines for the Filipinos. And we still allowed them to run for office and serve in the lower branch of the legislature. I guess to give the devil his due. And then by way of the Cooper Act, American leaders bought Vatican land in the Philippines and sold it to the Filipino tenants, creating a sizable class of small landowners. And then I'd already mentioned the USS Thomas with the educators, the Thomasites. We ended the repartimiento system. And if you recall from the very beginning of the class, remember the Spanish would force colonized people to do public works for them. So we ended that. And we ended a certain leva or tax that was hated by the Filipino people. So we tried accommodation to an extent, right? We tried accommodation to an extent. And some of our paternalism, I'm saying, may have been genuine, whereby we really did think we were superior to these people and we were doing things in their best interest. However, we also clearly looked out for ourselves. There's no doubt about that. We sought self-interest for sure. And by the way, with Emilio Aguinaldo, right? He would not cooperate with us, so we had him captured. He was a part of the Tagalog, like their language, the Tagalog tribe, and there was a different one called the Macabebe, and they were hired by American servicemen to come in and feign an attempt to make peace between the two tribes and unite against the Americans. And when he came to meet with them in a certain building, he was ambushed and captured. Okay, and we kept him arrested for quite some time. And he was kind of like their George Washington. All right, so any questions, Xavier? Oh, your LA trip. That's nice. That's very nice. I love Southern California. All right, and then the progressive movement. All right. With the progressive movement, okay, is there were perceived excesses, problems, injustices that were occurring from our second and great industrial revolution at the end of the 1800s And the progressives sought, right, ways to ameliorate or improve those perceived problems and injustices and excesses, etc., and a way to empower the less fortunate to make it in this new world so they would less likely become casualties of progress. All right. And very often, their idea of helping them involved bigger government. So this is part of the paradigm shift of the liberals changing from the old days under Thomas Jefferson being very libertarian, government don't tread on me, to becoming very pro big government for the less fortunate. All right. The progressives are a big part of that. Hillary Clinton called herself a progressive, in fact, as far as showing the what's the word I'm thinking of? It's the relevance of it today. Okay. So, I'm going to go back to that dinner. Let's see here. Yeah, the industrial order. So number one is that they were do-gooders. Okay. Court history praises the progressives. The progressives, by and large, and by the way, an older historian who still ranks highly in having his books read on the progressives is Richard Hofstadter. Okay. But at any rate, Richard Hofstadter contends they were part of the old middle class, right? So lawyers and university professors and writers and doctors, etc. Okay. So they were well-to-do people and well-educated people. Most of these progressive leaders at the local, state, and federal level. And they took it upon themselves to invest their time, their money, okay, amongst other things, in trying to improve these perceived problems. All right. So one of the big perceived problems was, right, is that the gap between the rich and the poor was growing. All right. And the arrogance of the rich was inciting and creating a sense of despair and perhaps rebellion amongst the poor. All right. So they wanted to help the poor out and give them hope in the American dream. All right. So the most salient, the one that stands out the most, I think of when you think of progressives, are the settlement houses and the settlement house movement. And oftentimes they were led by women, educated women. And so you had Jane Addams, you had Lillian Wald as like the most popular. They would come into an enclave. Remember, an enclave is like Chinatown, kind of ethnically homogenous part of town, right? From the same nation of origin. And oftentimes they socioeconomically were low, right, on the pyramid. So at any rate, they'd come into this area. They would learn their language very often. At least Jane Addams did, and Lillian Wald. And they would provide a myriad of services that were subsidized, that were paid by benefactors, and sometimes local or state government, but most of the time it was private for these poor immigrants. So, for instance, you had a lot of Poles and Hungarians from Central Europe in Chicago that Jane Addams worked with. You had a lot of Italians and Syrians and others in the areas around Cherry Street of New York, okay, where Lillian Wald worked. So you'd come into this area, you would provide babysitting, you would provide recreational sports, kind of keep the kids out of trouble, the poor kids, and keep them off the streets. You provided bathing and foods and meals and a place to stay and sleep. You provided education. You had night classes to get something equivalent to a GED for adults, and literacy classes for children, especially children that were trying to learn English or parents that were trying to learn English. You had vocational training, whereby they would teach them a trade. And you also had connection with employment organizations whereby they would try to directly get you a job with a skill that you had. All right. So, for instance, right, you had a guy named Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was a Danish immigrant, and he had a few jobs in the proletariat, in the manual laboring class that were quite miserable, quite ill paid, and quite tough to carry out. And he runs out of hope, and he succumbs to alcoholism. And he is found by a progressive social worker. And this progressive gentleman offers him a chance to come to a nearby settlement house. So he comes to the settlement house, and they did a like a skills test with him. And they discovered that he was college educated, and he was quite a good writer. So they hooked him up with a job with a local newspaper, and he began doing well, becoming renowned as a journalist. All right. Well, one day, as he was going through the 5 points, the infamous 5 points, right, of the dejected, primarily Italian immigrants now, it was once Irish. And of course, the 5 points were a symbol of the cycle of poverty, right? Like in sociology, they had lost all hope in the American dream, at least through legitimate means. So they would try to achieve the American dream through illegitimate means, prostitution, gambling, etc., theft. Okay. And then some of them just lost all hope in the American dream, period, through whatever legitimate or illegitimate means. And they just succumbed to alcoholism, etc. All right. And so a lot of the miseries that you find in the cycle of poverty were found in the 5 points. So he begins taking pictures. Okay. And the iconic one I remember are the kids sleeping together right there at the bottom. Okay. Outside. And he writes a book with his pictures, and it's called How the Other Half Lives. And in it, right, he is trying to create a sense of indignation, of righteous anger amongst the American public, to do something about this crippling poverty that people in the 5 points found themselves stuck in. All right. So at any rate, in addition to that, with the young, right? They took because sociology was a new science in the social sciences at this time, and they took to the power of nurture and the whole question of nature versus nurture, and how each influences us in our future development of our personality and our behavior, public persona, and all that. So at any rate, they were into nurture, right? Your environment and how you were brought up. And they believed, right, that all the difference in the world existed between an unhealthy environment and a healthy one. And so to them, right, these kids could be saved. They had they were victims of poverty. It almost wasn't their fault for succumbing to crime and other manifestations of just despair and giving up on the American dream for themselves. So at any rate, what Lillian Wald did at the bottom left corner, and that's Jane Addams next to her, that's Jacob Riis to the right. What Lillian Wald did is she made agreements with local prisons and jails and got the minors to be released. And she had a separate juvenile system to reform them, to educate them, to teach them job skills, to give them hope in the future. All right. That was Lillian Wald. So they were for, being lenient on crime committed by the poor, because they felt like they were stuck in a web and a cycle of poverty and despair. All right. So at any rate, with this one, right, that's what you get here is, and oh, by the way, what they're also going to do is they're going to be for a bigger government to help diminish the influence and power of big business and balance it by strengthening the voice of the people democratically and also strengthening government itself as a regulatory power over big business. Okay. So number one, they're being lionized, they're being praised, okay, as do-gooders. Then with number two, I take a 180 and I said, no, I think they had self-interest involved, right? Going back to this dinner party, right? I have that. You know what? I had initially seen it. Sorry. No, this is a number. It's in the intro. Sorry. Xavier. So the wealthiest 1% of families in 1890, contends historian Painter, owned 51% of the real property and personal property. 44% of families at the bottom owned only 1.2% of all property, right? The average income that an unskilled laborer earned a year was 360. Okay, an agricultural laborer, 260. A miner, maybe up to 500, right? But all in all, right, it said you needed $660 per year to subsist even remotely comfortably. So most people literally were obtaining subsistence wages, not even enough to subsist on. So you had a lot of people sending their children to work and supplement family income, etc. Amongst the poor, the women did not stay home as housewives. A lot of the women had to obtain employment of some sort. Okay. But amidst all this, there was a party by the Bradley Martin family, and it was $116 a plate. See right here in New York. And this was during the Depression of 1893. All right. A police chief known as Teddy Roosevelt came to their door and said, "Are you guys fools? Do you not understand what you are doing? You guys are like Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette just prior to the French Revolution, like eating your cake as the French peasants are starving without bread." And he said, you're gonna create disaster for all of us rich people, which included himself, Teddy Roosevelt, born into old wealth in Hyde Park, New York. So at any rate, some people contend that as old, middle class, well-to-do people, the progressives were afraid of a Marxist-like revolution. They were afraid of the poor, the proletariat, rising up against all of the well-to-do, including them. Jane Addams had a family involved in the famous Pullman strike in 1894, I think it was. The Pullman strike, right? The guy was given like a triple shift mandate. And he said, "I can't do it anymore. I can't even stand up anymore. I'm done." The guy says, "If you're done, then you're done with this job. Don't bother coming back." And a lot had happened up till then. Mr. Pullman made them live in his own town, Pullman. He kept high rent, high water and utilities bills for them. And when the 1893 Depression hit, he practically cut their wages in half. They said, "Okay, if you're going to cut our wages in half, then you're going to lower your rent. You're going to lower your bills, our bills." And he said, no. The workers were trying to solidify in a union, and he made many threats against that if they were to. All right. And they got the attention of a socialist, a guy who identified himself as a Socialist Party leader. His name was Eugene Debs, D-E-B-S. He had lost a brother in a railroad accident, and they wouldn't even give them the rest of the day to mourn his brother. They mandated that they continue to work. And so he became a socialist, right? And remember, like with gas and water socialism, which some of the progressives were, you believe that most things in the capitalist economy should be by merit, theoretically, right? That if you can't afford to buy a Porsche, then you don't buy a Porsche. And it sucks to be you, but that's the American way, right? But if you need medical care, if you need food, if you need electricity, if you need public transportation, those should be considered rights, whether you could pay for it or not. And if you can't pay for it, then taxpayers and the government ought to help pay for it and foot the bill for you. All right. So to me, socialism is kind of like diet communism. But at any rate, you take certain things and you exempt them from the merit-based system of capitalism. So at any rate, they're afraid of being caught in a war between the rich and the poor. Also, Jane Addams had a quote whereby she was interviewed and asked why she did what she did. She said, first of all, right, her dad was a preacher and was a philanthropist, literally a lover of humanity, and did a lot of philanthropic programs for the poor. And he inspired her, and she wanted to follow in her father's footsteps, right? Sounds great. Secondly, she said there weren't a lot of avenues open to educated middle-class women. They could only get hired at jobs that were considered pink collar, right? That were appropriate for women. And so she wanted to use her education, her money, her time to a good cause, a meaningful cause. But thirdly, right, she said she felt that every young immigrant boy that she reformed and gave hope to, right, and took in at her settlement house, at the Whole House in Chicago, was one fewer boy she had to worry about engaging in some criminal act against one of her nieces in the future. So that's another one, right? Is they were worried about not only a revolution, but also about crime committed by the poor and their sense of despair, of losing all hope. And they wanted to give hope to them, therefore, to make them a less likely, criminal threat in the future. Oh, and then also that there was some envy going on and jealousy, according to Hofstadter. He said that these old middle class people, prior to the 1880s, they were accustomed to having all leadership positions given to them, all social deference, people knowing their place and showing you not necessarily obedience, but just deference is just showing great respect and letting them know that you see them as above yourself and different from you, right? That they were accustomed to getting a lot of deference from the public. And that became eclipsed, says Hofstadter, by big business, by these robber barons, these titans, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. Okay. So hence, they were more than happy to make a villain out of big business and to try to strengthen government in particular to regulate big business. And not to mention, oftentimes, who do they want to run government agencies? The educated experts. And who are the most educated demographic in America? The old middle class. So what do you know? They want to run the show. All right. Then number 3, this is the conservative argument against progressivism. Real simple. The founding fathers wrote on in the Federalist Papers and in their correspondence, spoke in their speeches, right? Established a capitalist economy in following their belief, right, in meritocracy. You get what you merit. You get what you work for, you get what you earn, pure and simple. All right. With the progressives, to help pay for programs for the poor, they had to come up with money. Someone has to foot the bill, right? So they were for income taxes, for instance. But the income taxes they wanted were graduated. So meaning, right, if you make up to 100,000, you pay a certain percentage. If you make up to 250,000, you pay a higher percentage. You make above 250,000, you pay an even higher percentage. You know what I'm going to say, right? You've heard it. The conservatives are going to say that is punishing people for their hard work and success, almost punitively raising the tax rates for those who make more money. All right. And I know in academia, I've read of so many cases of people inheriting wealth in one way or another. You know, once they gain a little bit of success, there are things that just seem to happen that help further success become even easier once they get established. And that's what I've read of Rockefeller and Carnegie for sure. But at the same time, I can say and try to support this argument because we're simply on it. And of course, I'll go against it the very next section. You know, I have an attorney best friend, and he has his own firm, and he works his bottom off to the point of having health problems. And therefore, as a result of that, he has progressively made each year more and more money with more and more clients. And he said, like, especially in the state of California, that it is ridiculous how badly he feels deprived of those fruits by how high of a tax rate he has to pay from his income. All right, and so at any rate, that's the simple thesis here, the conservative argument against progressive government. All right. And then you have the rebuttal to that. And the rebuttal to that, you could probably guess, right? Says that life is so much more complex than looking at poverty and wealth through the prism of meritocracy. So let's say you're born, especially at this time, without a lot of social services available. You're born and you're orphaned at a young age. You have to drop out of school. You have to get a job. You're trying to feed your younger siblings. You're asking for a nearby neighbor to help you out with meals and babysitting when you have to go work and your younger siblings need care. You know, I'm being dramatic here, but you come as an immigrant and you're trying your best to learn the English language, and no one is hiring you because you don't speak English. All right. And that metaphor of that 100-meter dash, some people have, you know, backpacks on that are just filled with stones, making it much more difficult to run that 100 yards. All right. Some people do lose hope, and they need someone like, as received Jacob Reese, reaching out a hand and giving them a second chance to try to get a decent job, etc., go back to school, etc. All right. So there might be some, you know, merit and logic to sociology's notion of people getting mired in cycles of poverty. All right. And of course, there are instances of people inheriting their wealth, getting some very, very lucky breaks in life, etc., whereby they just dodged bullets that other people didn't dodge. So, for instance, right, I consider myself fairly soft as an adjective with the homeless. I'm always trying to buy them food and drink, but I don't give them cash. I just don't. I usually don't carry cash anyway, but still, beside the point, I probably wouldn't if I had it. But look at that innate distrust I have, right? Somewhere subconsciously, I believe there's a high percentage and chance that that person had made some poor decisions that involve some type of addiction to get in the homeless position that he or she presently finds him or herself in. And that's not a very fair presumption that I bring to the table. I don't begin to know that person. They could have lost their whole family in a car accident, God forbid, and just kind of went off the emotional and psychological spectrum. There's all kinds of stuff that people have been through that we can't judge, we shouldn't judge, we have no idea. All right. So, at any rate, this is the liberal rebuttal to the conservative complaint against progressive big government and helping out the poor. Because again, I will say, in fairness and trying to balance these two, as I'm supporting the liberal argument now, it does hurt. It does hurt when you feel like you work your bottom off. And I don't pretend to have anything tantamount to the men that are sweating and working with their hands. But as much as I read and study and write all the time, when you look at the difference between the net and the gross in your paycheck, it hurts. It hurts. Sometimes there's a big difference between those two. They take a lot out. But then you see these people. All right. And we have no idea what brought them there and how minimal amount of help might be required to pull them out. All right. So I think that's finally it, Xavier. Thank you for staying with me. We went over an hour. I'm going to check the chat and make sure you haven't written anything since then. If it will. Okay. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed your LA trip. Southern California is weather-wise, beach-wise, it's just gorgeous. All right. So Xavier, if you have nothing further to say, I'm going to go ahead and let you go, okay? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for showing up. You'll get your credit for it for both assignments.